The shortest war in history lasted less than an hour. A palace burned, a navy sank, and an entire war ended before most people finished breakfast. How did that even happen? In the late 19th century, the island of Zanzibar sat off the coast of East Africa, rich from trade and strategically valuable. Ships from Arabia, India, and Europe passed through its ports, carrying spices, ivory, textiles, and stories from across the world. Empires were circling the globe like sharks at feeding time, and Britain wanted influence over Zanzibar. Not necessarily because they loved the beaches, but because controlling ports meant controlling money, ships, and power. And in the age of empire, power was everything. For years, the British had supported rulers who cooperated with them. Treaties were signed, promises were exchanged, and diplomacy was backed by the silent presence of warships offshore. It was politics the old-fashioned way: quiet pressure, agreements behind closed doors, and the occasional reminder that the Royal Navy was parked just over the horizon. Everyone understood the balance of power, even if no one said it out loud. Then, in August of 1896, the Sultan of Zanzibar died suddenly. His death created a vacuum, and in politics, vacuums never stay empty for long. Within hours, a new ruler seized the palace and declared himself Sultan without British approval. His name was Khalid bin Bargash, and he intended to hold the throne. This was not the plan.
Here we go.
The British consul sent a message to Khalid. Step down, leave the palace, avoid problems. It was written in the polite language of diplomacy, but the meaning was unmistakable. Khalid ignored it. Instead, he barricaded himself inside the palace, gathered a few thousand supporters, positioned artillery, and prepared to defend his claim. He believed resistance might force negotiations, or at least buy time. From Khalid's point of view, this probably felt bold, defiant, historic, perhaps even heroic. From the British point of view, it felt inconvenient, and empires are not known for their patience with inconvenience.
Not impressed.
The Royal Navy moved ships into position in the harbor. Sailors adjusted rigging, officers checked range calculations, and cannons were slowly turned toward the palace. Marines prepared on deck, waiting for orders that everyone already knew were coming. One final ultimatum was delivered. Leave by 9 a.m. or we open fire. The message was clear, and the deadline was very real. Khalid stayed. Maybe he believed the British were bluffing. Maybe he thought the palace walls would hold. Maybe he simply refused to back down in front of his own supporters.
Bold move.
At exactly 9:02 a.m., the British began bombarding the palace. The first shells struck with a force that shattered windows and sent splinters of wood flying into the air. Wooden walls shattered almost instantly. Fires spread fast, feeding on beams and dry timber. The palace, built largely of wood, burned like dry kindling. Smoke climbed into the morning sky, visible from ships far out at sea. Inside, chaos replaced confidence. Soldiers who had expected a standoff suddenly found themselves in a storm of explosions and smoke. Orders were shouted, then lost in the thunder of cannon fire. The noise alone was enough to disorient anyone who had never experienced bombardment before. Outside, ships in the harbor fired with mechanical precision. Cannons recoiled, crews reloaded, and the next volley followed without hesitation. This was not a duel. It was a demonstration. Industrial firepower against a wooden palace was never going to be a fair contest.
Not a duel.
One of Zanzibar's few ships, a royal yacht armed with a single cannon, tried to return fire. The crew managed a few shots, more symbolic than effective. It lasted minutes before being struck and sunk, disappearing beneath the harbor water in a cloud of smoke and steam. The attempt was brave, but bravery does not stop artillery.
That was quick.
The bombardment continued. Flames climbed higher, consuming entire sections of the palace. Roofs collapsed inward, sending sparks and burning debris into the streets below. The palace began to crumble, piece by piece, as if time itself were speeding up. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. At 9:40 a.m., a white flag was raised. The firing stopped. Smoke drifted over the city as the sound of cannons faded, replaced by the crackle of burning wood and the distant noise of people emerging cautiously from hiding. 38 minutes. That was the entire war. To put that in perspective, 38 minutes is shorter than most TV episodes, shorter than a commute, shorter than the time it takes to bake a frozen pizza. It's about the length of a gym workout people promise themselves they'll do every morning. It's barely enough time to finish a cup of coffee while scrolling the news.
Still scrolling.
Casualties were brutally uneven. Hundreds of defenders were killed or wounded in the bombardment and the fires that followed. Entire sections of the palace had collapsed before many inside even understood what was happening. On the British side, there was only a single injured sailor, who reportedly hurt himself on deck during the chaos. The imbalance was staggering. History's shortest war was not just short. It was completely one-sided. It was less a battle and more a demonstration of overwhelming force. Khalid himself escaped the palace during the bombardment and fled to the German consulate, where he was granted asylum. He slipped through the city while the palace burned behind him, leaving the throne he had claimed only hours earlier. The man who had started a war in the morning was already a refugee by lunchtime.
Speedrun politics.
The British quickly installed a new, more cooperative sultan. Agreements were signed, authority was restored, and trade resumed as if nothing had happened. Ships continued to arrive in the harbor, and merchants returned to their routines. Within days, the world had largely moved on. News of the war traveled slowly, and by the time many people heard about it, it was already history. But the story remained because it was so absurdly fast, so strangely lopsided, that it almost feels unreal. It reads less like a war and more like a historical glitch, something that wasn't supposed to happen that way but did. Wars are supposed to be long. They're supposed to be campaigns, years of struggle, maps with arrows moving slowly across continents. History teaches us to imagine trenches, sieges, and drawn-out battles. We expect hardship measured in years, not minutes. But sometimes history doesn't follow the script. Sometimes it ends before the audience even understands what's happening. What makes the Anglo-Zanzibar War so fascinating isn't just its length. It's how perfectly it captures the imbalance of power during the Age of Empires. One side had wooden buildings, outdated artillery, and hope. The other had steel warships, trained crews, and industrial firepower. The result was never really in doubt. It wasn't really a fight, it was a collision.
And a fast one.
Yet there's something strangely human in the story. Khalid likely believed resistance would force negotiations, that showing strength might earn respect or at least delay the inevitable. Leaders throughout history have made similar calculations, sometimes wisely, sometimes disastrously. History is full of moments like that. Decisions made in rooms thick with heat and pride, where people convince themselves that things will somehow go differently. Confidence can feel like strategy, even when it isn't. And sometimes the difference between courage and miscalculation is only visible afterward. And sometimes those decisions last 38 minutes. After the smoke cleared, the burned remains of the palace stood as a reminder of how quickly events can spiral. Charred beams and blackened walls marked the place where a government had stood only hours before. The city slowly returned to normal, but the scar remained, both in stone and in memory. Time compresses strangely in moments like these. 38 minutes for the war, but decades of consequences for the region, for politics, for the lives of the people who lived there. Empires moved on, borders shifted, and the world kept turning, but the story endured. That's the thing about history. The turning points aren't always the longest events. Sometimes they're the fastest. Sometimes they arrive without warning and disappear before anyone fully understands them. A signature on a document, a single shot fired, a decision made at the wrong moment. Or a war that begins and ends before breakfast is over.
Worst morning ever.
Today, the story of Zanzibar in 1896 survives as a historical curiosity, a strange footnote that historians love to mention. The shortest war ever fought, a record unlikely to be broken, and one that still surprises people when they first hear it. But behind the number, behind the trivia, was a real city, real people, and a morning when the sky filled with smoke and thunder. Behind every historical statistic is a human story, and those stories are rarely simple. History can be absurd. History can be dark. And sometimes history is over before anyone realizes it even began. If you enjoyed this absurd chapter of human history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the top left video to explore another unbelievable historical failure. We'll see you in the next disaster. Thanks for watching.